Final Fantasy IV is one of those classic games that almost every RPG fan has probably taken for a spin at some point in their lives. Now, whether it be on the Super Nintendo back in the day, WonderSwan, probably not, PSP or mobile, there are definitely a lot of ways to actually get into the game. Now, if you've been away from the game for a long time, you may be wondering if it still holds up to this day. Well, slight spoiler alert, yes, it does, and I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy IV and why you can't go wrong picking this version of the game up in this retro review. Danny from the Famicast here. If you're new to the channel, please be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications. Sign up in the comments below, and we may read your comment out on our bi-weekly show called the Famicast. Today, though, we're taking a look at Final Fantasy IV Advance on the Game Boy Advance. Now, the story of Final Fantasy IV is a little bit dated by today's RPG standards, but if you look at the game in the context of when it was actually released, originally on the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, there are quite a few aspects that were certainly ahead of its time. Now, the overall arc is about redemption and friendship. I think something that most of us can relate to, at least in some respect. Now, following the Dark Knight Cecil as he leads the fleet from military superpower Baron, we quickly learn that things are not as they seem. Cecil is distressed for having to carry out numerous atrocities in the name of the king. Now, so much so that he's actually branded a traitor and then basically has to go on the run. Now, along the way, you'll run into a number of different characters that have their own motivations and personalities. Now, although their reasons are different, they all come together in their goal of taking out the big bad, Golbez. And they all come together as this group of friends that genuinely care about each other. Now, of course, by today's standards, again, the story beats can be a little bit abrupt, like this kind of like the pacing and stuff like that. But I still feel that you can definitely get what Square was going for here. Now, again, in the context of the time, things still hold up, in my opinion. Now, not only that, but I really feel that there was a great variety of locations to visit and some interesting NPCs to come across throughout the adventure. Now, on a personal note, and probably like you, this isn't my first time actually playing the game. Now, I played the North American Final Fantasy II back in the day on the Super Nintendo, borrowing the cart from a good buddy of mine back in the late 90s. Now, at the time, I couldn't make it through to the very end of the game. I just couldn't get there. I made it as far as the Return of Baron, only to be roasted by Bagan. Now, I don't remember what exactly was holding me back then either, but, since then, I've actually tried to go back to the game with the PlayStation version in Final Fantasy Chronicles, and then, of course, this Game Boy Advance version of the game. Now, it wasn't until this current run-through until I basically finally beat the game. Now, the Game Boy Advance version of the game does have a few extras that were not found in the previous entries. Now, the script here has been revamped to more closely reflect that of the original Japanese. Character portraits are now available in dialogue boxes. You have the ability to swap out characters in and out of your party later on in the game. And you can even tackle a bonus dungeon. So that's pretty cool that, there is some extra stuff here, even if you played the game back in the day. I think this kind of goes without saying, but just in case you are wondering, Final Fantasy IV Advance is a turn-based RPG, and this time around Square, or Square Enix, whatever you want to say, they implemented what's called an active time battle system, an ATB system. Now again, you probably already know what this is, but just in case, this is like a timing element that's introduced here to basically enable you to choose your actions whenever you're playing the game. Now, unlike the Super Nintendo and PlayStation versions of the Game Boy Advance version actually shows like a gauge in real time, giving the players a clear indication of when they're able to perform their next action. Now, while pretty basic in this day and age, I'd say, I'm still a pretty big fan of the battle system found here in Final Fantasy IV. Now, the variety of attacks, some specific to certain characters, magic, summons, and other special abilities I think they're really well done. Now, they really give each character a bit of a different feeling, even though you are primarily just controlling what they do through menu options. Now, some quality of life improvements were made here as well. Now, the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy IV from Final Fantasy Chronicles introduced the ability to run while holding the cancel button while in towns or dungeons. Now, this is still here, but you now have the ability to basically choose in the configuration menu to basically make it so that you're running, basically you're always running, or that you could run while pressing B. Now, traveling the overworld here, I'd say that it can be a little bit slow going, but once you play for a little bit and once you get some of like these handful of vehicles or chocobo or something like that that's available, things really start to speed up quite a bit. A quick save function is also available in Final Fantasy IV Advance. So to access this, basically outside of battles, you're able to save anywhere in the game, and this can be accessed via the main menu. Now, once initiated, your current play session closes, and you're brought back to the main menu, and then you can shut off the system and all that type of stuff. Now, when you actually load up the quick save file, this temporary save goes away, and you pick up from where you left off. So it's only like a one-time type of thing. Now, while this might sound kind of pointless to some, I found it to come in handy. You know, for my most recent playthrough, I was playing on a DS Lite, so with no sleep mode in the game, this is pretty useful when I didn't have time to get to a proper save point, or I needed just to come to a stop to like eat dinner or do whatever. The visuals here are very true to the original Super Nintendo version of the game. Now the colors, the sprites, environments, all this stuff looks pretty good, especially when you're playing on a smaller screen. The audio here is actually pretty awesome, with some of the most memorable tracks from the Final Fantasy series. Now by and large, things on the audio and visual front in this version of the game are pretty solid. Now Final Fantasy IV on the Game Boy Advance, even with all that said, it's not without issues. Now, being more or less a port of the previously released WonderSwan version of the game, now some things just were simply not optimized for the Game Boy Advance hardware. Now, in my time playing, and maybe some of you guys out there as well, there are times when the game slows down, particularly when in battles. Now, while this usually isn't a problem, or wasn't really a problem for me, it can get a bit annoying when you're like in intense fights and when this type of stuff happens. There are also times when your characters might have their turn skipped over, or characters might have 2 attacks in a row or something like that. Now, it's definitely odd, and when you're in the heat of battle, it can really ruin some strategies that you're trying to implement if this type of stuff happens. Now, most of these performance issues are only present in the North American version and the first release of the game in Japan. Now, Square Enix did release an updated version of the game in Japan that fixed most, if not all, of the issues present in the game. This is dubbed the E4 version of the game, which is indicated by this stamp that appears on the front of the cart. Now, the European version of Final Fantasy IV was based on this. Now, additionally, the version that is found on the Wii U Virtual Console in Japan is also the E4 version of the game. For all of you collectors out there, today we're actually going to take a look at a few Final Fantasy IV Advance related items. Now, I do have this super cool Final Fantasy IV Game Boy Micro, but if you want to see more about that, I would suggest checking out my video that's actually dedicated specifically to that. Now, as for the game itself, there's some pretty obvious differences between the Japanese and Western packaging. Now, in line kind of with the Super Famicom release, and also kind of like the Final Fantasy games that were released around the time, the box art here is actually pretty simple. It's white, and it features both Cecil and Kain on the front. Now, overall, it looks super classy, and again, it really is in line with the modern Final Fantasy packaging of the games that released in Japan around the era. Now, my version here is the E3 version, or the version that still has the bugs. Now, the E4 version, it's a bit harder to find, and even when you do, it can actually be quite expensive. Now, that's not to say that the Western box art here is bad by any stretch of the imagination. Now, it might look a bit familiar if you just seen the Game Boy Micro packaging, because it uses the same exact image. Now, while I prefer the Japanese box art for the game, I still do like the illustrations used here that feature Cecil, Kain, and Rosa alongside the logo. Now, it's been fantastic revisiting Final Fantasy IV and clearing the game for the first time. Now, it's definitely been a long time coming for me. And these old RPGs can really take you back to a time when RPGs, and maybe just life in general, were just a little bit simpler. Now, I think at this point, no matter what platform you're playing the game on, you can't go wrong. Now, if you're wanting to play it on a Nintendo platform, at least at the time of this recording, this is your best bet. Now, there are some performance issues that pop up here and there, but the story, while somewhat dated, helped set the standard for what kind of storytelling was possible in RPGs and video games as a whole. You definitely can't go wrong here. As always, thank you guys so much for checking out this video. If you like what you see, please feel free to drop this video a like. If you're new to the channel, please be sure to subscribe. We've got tons of podcasts, video reviews, looks at cool retro classics just like this, and a whole lot more. Again, this is Danny from the Famicast. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you later.